Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. My name is Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and my guest today is Drew Nucci, who's a research associate at West Ed Research Agency. Drew, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for inviting me, Sam.
Yeah, it's great to talk. We're going to talk about one of your recent articles that came out in Educational Studies and Mathematics, but we're also going to talk a little bit about a project that you're working on related to AI tools for teachers. So I'm excited for both parts of those conversations. But I mentioned that you're at West Ed. I first want to just start, make sure the listeners are aware of West Ed. They might have heard of West Ed around education research and things, but maybe you could give us the short pitch of what West Ed does.
Sure. WestEd is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, national organization that conducts educational research, but also provides professional learning and technical support for districts. It's got about 1,400 people working across the country.
And it's no longer just the West, right? It's
No
definitely
longer just the
nationwide
West.
now.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Drew, before West Ed, though, where did you do your doctoral studies and who did you work with there in grad school?
Yes, I was at the University of Washington and I worked with Kara Jackson, Elham Kazemi, and Katie Lewis there in the math education curriculum and instruction group.
Excellent. And I know your dissertation looked at teacher care, and you're in mathematics education space, but you're looking at the caring relationships between teacher and students. And that's not just your dissertation. The Educational Studies in Mathematics article that we're going to talk about is also about teacher care in an online kind of environment. But first of all, what led to you kind of focusing and becoming interested in teacher care?
Yeah, well, I before I was a PhD student, I taught math for 18 years in Maine and New Mexico. And I was at four schools, Sam. And all four schools at the beginning of the school year would have these meetings and they would say sort of what makes our school special. And all four schools in those opening meetings, the idea of relationships was foundational to what a school thought made it special. But we never drilled down to look at what about those relationships is so valuable and valuable to whom? How are they formed and how does it connect to actual instruction and learning? So those are the kinds of questions that germinated my interest in care theory. So that's why care is important to me, but then why care is important to the field is, we have a substantial amount of scholarly evidence to show that caring relationships bolster student learning, identity formation, a sense of belonging in the classroom, and that feeds motivation, feeds engagement and persistence, and it is tied to kids learning and having a good experience in school.
Yeah, I know a lot of people use that quote of students don't care what you know until they know that you care. That's a common quote in education circles. But I think it's interesting to see your work because you actually take care and you make it the focus of the research and you really dig into it and into a deeper level. And so it's kind of saying, that's not just a nice quote. You're actually taking that seriously as a scholar that we have to understand the caring relationship in mathematics contexts.
Yeah, and the relationship is really key there. I think that that's one really important thing because people use care and caring colloquially, right? But really, in care theory, care is about the relationship. In other words, it's not so much that Sam is a caring person or not a caring person. Rather, it's is the relationship one of a reciprocal care where we are both feeling each other's motivations and then taking actions to support and feel supported by the other person.
hmm Well, let's dig into this a little bit more with the Educational Studies in Mathematics article. So, this article is entitled The Role of an Online Learning Environment in Teacher Care for Secondary Mathematics Students. And that's available now in volume 117 of ESM. So, what was the focus of that article in particular with regard to teacher care?
Yeah, so that article was really focusing on how can we think about the interplay between learning environments and the relationships that form in those learning environments. And so an opportunity, COVID was terrible for so many reasons, but an opportunity that it presented was we had this situation where schools and classrooms were going from in-person environment to online environment immediately. And that immediacy meant that we were able to see these learning environments in relief. And so what this study was really looking at was, okay, Granted, this was during COVID, and there were all kinds of social factors going on that really made this an anxious time for teachers and for students. But if we look at the learning environment that a school used, in this case, it was using Zoom and Canvas and PowerPoint. If we look at the learning environment, the digital learning environment that was created, what were the constraints and affordances that that learning environment provided for both interpersonal care, but also care for learning, academic care? And then how also did being in the online learning environment, how did that influence the teacher's dispositions towards the relational work? And so by dispositions, I mean sort of the habits of mind that inform action. So that's what I was looking at in the study.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I was drawn to this article when I get the alerts with the new table of contents and stuff, and this definitely seemed interesting, an interesting angle at it, and something that I think is important. And I think also a lot of teachers on the ground could feel that something important was happening, not just with COVID, but also with the shift, and then how are we coming back and all this. So it's interesting stuff to dig into. I am curious, and also just to help us set the stage, what kind of data did you have available that you could then analyze for this study?
Yeah, unfortunately, because it was COVID, what I couldn't do is go into classrooms and observe, right? Because I think that the district was rightfully protective of the teachers and students. But what they did allow me to do was participate and ask questions and record department meetings and also to interview teachers. And I was even able to form a little student group where students could come and tell us about their experience with online learning. Now that student data is not a part of this ESM study, but it did provide a nice context for me to make sense of what I was hearing from teachers in the department meetings and in my interviews with teachers about how they were thinking about building pedagogically supportive relationships with kids during online learning.
Yeah, excellent. So, I want to save some time for us to talk about your AI project. So, I'm just going to cut right to the chase with this ESM article and just basically ask what were some of the key findings that your analysis revealed? And having done it too, I'm also just curious what has stayed on your mind about what you did find from this analysis.
So the key findings of the analysis was that the online learning environment, and it was again difficult to disaggregate from what was going on with COVID at the time, but it really constrained teachers' ability to care for student learnings in a couple of important ways. One is that for me to care for your learning, I have to actually center your thinking first. And the online learning environment really curtailed teachers' ability to see student thinking, hear student thinking, and therefore center student thinking. So that was one thing. The second is that the school that I was at had their normal curriculum involved a lot of group work with high cognitive demand problems, group worthy problems, multiple representations. And the teachers really had a hard time taking that model and transferring it to the more didactic structure of the online learning environment. And so the learning field collapsed so that it became much more low cognitive demand, much more sort of I do, we do, you do, where kids were working individually to solve simplified problem sets. So that's important academically, but then that's also important interpersonally and socially because one of the things that the teachers in because I worked with these teachers before and after COVID, one of the things that these teachers really cared about was having kids connect with each other, building community. And we know from the literature this is an important part of building a caring environment in a classroom and a sense of belonging. And so the reason that that is also a problem is that it obstructed the teacher's ability to really care for the kids to connect with each other in a way that they had been doing in person. Those are the constraints. Now, one affordance was that teachers were able to have more personal and private conversations with students about things that the kids were struggling with, right? So, one of the parts of an empathetic disposition towards care is caring about kids, being a partner with kids in how, in not just in school, but in managing their life, right? And then their problems and their goals. And so for the kids who sought the teachers out, they could have one-on-one conversations like you and I are having right now without fear of being interrupted because of the waiting room, right? A completely private environment that frankly is not really something that you can have in the hustle and bustle of an in-person school. So there were some affordances there for the kids who initiated a reciprocated relationship. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is that looking at sort of how the teachers' dispositions changed towards care, the teachers became a lot more transactional with their approach towards care because a transactional disposition actually involves making my care somewhat contingent on something that you do. And the contingency here was that the teachers were really, their care efforts were contingent on students initiating or reciprocating. And they said 80% of their kids they didn't know. And I'm sure a lot of the teachers listening would definitely remember this. They're staring at a sea of blank screens. That was important because they were narrating, the teachers were narrating sort of like in person, I would sit down to this kid next to this kid, and I would do that every day. So they were narrating a certain sort of relational tenacity they didn't have in the online learning environment.
Or in the online learning environment, it would only happen if the kid turned on their video or came to a private Zoom session or sent a message. So like the student has to sort of do something to kind of keep it going, whereas in person, the teacher could kind of do that on the teacher's own initiative.
Right. And so that's one of the big things you asked, what's kind of resonating with me? It's kind of one of my big next questions is that the teachers were narrating that loss of relational tenacity, but we have to be a little sort of critical when we think about that because there's a way in which the teachers were thinking about themselves as the drivers of relationship, right? And not really accounting fully for the student's agency, the student's authorship in that relationship. So, on the one hand, the literature says that transactional dispositions towards care make care dependent on student action. But on the other hand, maybe we kind of want to think about care as dependent on the student agency to be in that reciprocal caring relationship. And so that requires, I think, some further theorization.
And this is also with secondary students where it's kind of like they're of an age that it maybe makes sense. It might be appropriate that they take some initiative or that can be expected on both sides, or that the students, if they want to withdraw, it's somewhat in their rights as secondary students to withdraw a little bit.
Yeah, and it also brings into this question of sort of like power in the teacher-student relationship, which is something that I take up more fully in the dissertation work because the dissertation work is about specifically white teachers' care in racially diverse classes. And so how do we think about the racial power that's involved with with the whiteness of schooling and the power that's involved with teachers as a carrier of institutional authority and kids that understanding teachers as having that authority.
Mhm. So I want to go back to the very first constraint you mentioned, and I promise I'm not going to drill down on all of the stuff you shared. But I just am turning over some thoughts in my own head about that first one because you talked about the centering or the actually maybe the lack of centering of students' mathematical thinking, and then that sort of hindered in the online environment. It hindered the care relationship about their mathematical learning because their students' thinking wasn't quite as centered. That's kind of my paraphrase of that. On the right track?
Sounds fair to me.
Okay, fair enough at least. So I'm thinking about that because here in our department, we have several courses that we teach online. Some of them have mathematics content in the course as well. And we've talked here, like myself, my colleague John Lannon, and several others, we've talked about how in the online space, we actually feel like we can give more attention to the individual students' mathematical thinking because we actually have a moment that we can spend with each one where it's like, okay, you shared your reasoning, you shared your explanation. I can give feedback on it very specifically. I could ask for a revision or like, here's something you might want to revise to make it even clearer. And that we were saying when we teach in person in the classroom, we kind of get a vague sense of several students' mathematical thinking, but we don't actually get attended like moment like for each student individually. And in the online space, we actually do have each student individually. So help me square that experience that we've had here with what you're saying in the context that you were studying.
Yeah, I think the context is of course the key thing. You know, it's there's a reason that the title of the piece is not the role of online learning environments, but the role of an online learning environment, right? There were all kinds of institutional contexts at the school that I was at. And then, of course, there's the COVID context.
Hmm.
So what you're describing wasn't happening in this context, right? And so I think that what you're pointing to here, or what I'm thinking about, is, and I think that this is kind of my, you said what findings are sticking with me.
Hmm.
This is what big one, which is that the tools we use inform the learning environment, and then the learning environment informs how we use the tools. So in your case, you have a different sort of institutional context that informs the way you are able to use the tools in your class that is different from the school in the ESM study. So you have this reciprocal relationship between tools and environment, and then this reciprocal relationship between environment and relationships.
So that's really helpful then. So it's not that there's something inherent to the online environment that decenters students' mathematical thinking. It was just in the particular context during that time of reacting to COVID that it just turns out that the mathematical thinking of the students was decentered, but it's not that online environments have to decenter it. You could have an online environment that actually puts student thinking in the center and then allows teachers to show care for that thinking.
100%.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. I do want to pivot us over towards some other kinds of relationships that are forming now, which are relationships between students and artificial intelligence tools or teachers and AI tools. So I want you to share with us an exciting project that you're collaborating on. It's studying AI tools with math teachers. So what are you developing? What are you studying as part of this project? Help us get to know this work that's underway.
Sure. IES, the Institute of Educational Sciences, funded a center at the University of Washington, an R&D center. And this center has developed a tool that teachers can use. It's totally free. It's Colleague AI, so colleague.ai. And what this tool does is it enables teachers to build lesson plans and build assessments and rubrics. And the training for the model was all based on math education research. Basically, 1,000 lesson plans were graded by a series of features. And that was the training data for this AI model. So the sort of theory here is that teachers have a ton of knowledge. Teachers have a ton of heart, and they're also overworked. What does it look like if we give them a tool that they can use to create better lesson plans and better assessments that also saves them time? That's the goal. So that's the development part, right? It's research and development. That's the development part.
And you said it's mathematics lessons, like it's that's what it's kind of focused on. Is that across grade levels or?
Across grade levels, there's also a mode where you can use it for science or ELA.
Oh, okay, wow. But you're probably yeah focused on the math team, I'm
I'm
guessing.
focused on the math. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the development part. The research part is to look at, okay, how is it that teachers are using, learning about, maybe avoiding generative AI tools for instructional tasks. And so by that, I mean things like planning, teaching, assessment, their own professional learning, the other administrative tasks that go with being a teacher. How are teachers using those generative AI tools for those tasks? And what kind of learning most helps them use the tools for ways that transform teaching and learning in the classroom? So we're definitely focused here on AI as a teacher tool, not so much AI for student use at this point.
Right, right. And what stage are you in the work? So it sounds like it's already available for people to use, or there's features that are coming later, or where are you at in that phased timeline?
Yeah, Colleague AI has been available for over a year now, and it's constantly being refined. So it's available for use, and one of the things that I like about it is the way it actually scaffolds teacher learning. So I could say, hey, I need a lesson plan for my seventh graders tomorrow. We're doing ratios and proportionality it's October and the kids are super into baseball. Give me a lesson plan that's going to speak to that. But once it generates the lesson plan for you, it also then prompts a teacher to say, hey, maybe you want to ask me, the AI, to improve this, to have more conceptual questions, right? Or more opportunities for student discourse. So it does that kind of scout. All of that functionality is built out and teachers can try it. So the research part right now, what we're doing is we are actually recruiting teachers in the state of Washington who are either math or science teachers who will come and talk to us about the ways in which they are using AI, the ways they're learning about AI. And that's going to be that those sort of in-depth qualitative case studies are then going to feed into continuing refinement and improvement of Colleague as a teaching tool and the professional learning that surrounds it.
Hmm. Very exciting. Yeah, I'll have to check that out. And, the big concern with all the AI tools coming out now is what were they trained on? What are they basing all of their artificial intelligence on? So to have this one that's actually based in mathematics education sort of literature, scholarship ideas that we would be more proud of is probably an encouraging thing versus what some other AI tools might be pulling from.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly the case. There are a lot of teachers who are using, for example, ChatGPT to build lesson plans. But what is ChatGPT's metrics of quality? Whereas for Colleague, the metrics of quality come from the research base and then this and 1,000 lessons that have been sort of coded by math ed experts.
Wonderful. Well, Drew, thanks so much for being here. I've been speaking with Drew Nucci from West Ed, and I always like to finish with a kind of personal question. So I know you've gotten your PhD recently, and you're doing these exciting things at West Ed, but I wonder if you imagine not being in math education, is there an alternative career that you could see for yourself?
Oh, for sure. You know what I would love to do? I would love to be an auto mechanic.
Hmm.
Get those hands dirty, figure out puzzles, make old things run like new or better. That to me sounds like a dream.
Domestic, international, certain, is there a certain brand that would be your specialty or kind of all of it?
I do like Volkswagens.
Mhm.
So maybe I'll stick with Germany.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I appreciate talking to you. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Sam. I really appreciated talking with you. It was really fun.